founder at Minusia, and I have Zach, Minusia's managing director since December. Zach, I think it was December you took
That's
over,
right.
right? And we also have a good friend and founder or co-founder rather at ClearScope, Bernard. Bernard, hi.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. We've known each other for how many years now? I think like seven, eight, nine. I don't know. It's been too long.
It's been too long, right? I first got introduced to ClearScope and like I met you. I think back when I was doing freelancing, which is like definitely 7, 8 years ago, even more than that at this point. And so, things are changing. So we thought, why don't we bring Bernard back to chat a bit about all these changes, right? The one of the previous webinars I believe we did was around the future of SEO, and it did really well. It really resonated with people, and so we thought, why don't we bring Bernard back, right? Um, I would like to start from you co-founded ClearScope, or you got involved in that. How many years ago? Like, was it 8, 9?
Close to 10. We're
Close to
coming
10.
up on maybe November of this year would be 10 years. Yeah, so 10 years, clear scope, and now I think like 13 years in deep in the weeds of search engine optimization at this point.
Besides the obvious, like, which is AI search, what has changed? Since like when you started, like when you got into this world. What has changed? Obviously, AI search is one, and we will focus on that. But I guess what I'm trying to get from you in this answer is like some of the fundamentals, are they still there? Because I think that people are like, there's a lot of noise right now, and they are trying to find always something new to kind of hang from. And I would like to hear from you. Are are there any things that are still there, and what things have changed um, throughout these years?
Yeah, I mean, I would say long story very short. There are still some fundamentals that work, but for the most part, a lot has changed. So the fundamentals that still are important are obviously technical search engine optimization. If your site does not load, cannot be crawled, and has a bunch of technical issues with it, then search or AI search cannot access it, will not read it, cannot render it, and you will obviously not be visible in either search or AI visibility. So that's still the same. And then links and brand equity are still fundamentally important as well. Back in the day, it would be in some ways easier to gain, authority because you could buy links through private blog networks. Any old link was, the going thought was a link is a link is a link. And it doesn't really matter. I think the models have gotten a lot smarter, and a link is no longer just a link. It requires that link requires relevance and its own topical authority to then contribute weight to any other articles or products or services that it links to. So for the most part, I would say those two elements are fundamentally still about the same. And then I think we've seen a dramatic shift in terms of how you get rewarded, keyword selection, or the evolution of it towards searcher intent, and just overall these different competing ideas now around what is quality content and what does visibility and winning in today's world mean. And those are very, very different than we were, say, 5, 10 years ago.
I don't know if you've heard, but I'm surprised about that. But PBNs, they are back, especially in the context of AI search. I think that spam has increased dramatically, even though I don't have any like data to support that statement. But uh, and if it hasn't already, like it will, right? Because I think that there is this perception, which for the most part true, right? um, that like the velocity of mentions on the web, regardless of the website and how high quality it is and trustworthy and whatnot, this can help with AI search visibility. And in that context, I think that people are, instead of moving forward with new ideas and new tactics and methodologies and whatnot, uh, we slide kind of backwards. And like I think PBNs might be one of these things that came back from the dead. I don't know if you have any opinions around that, but that's what I see. I've been seeing
Yes.
lately.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. PBNs are back. So, we've done a lot of thorough research on our end at ClearScope, and it's been clear that the latest updates with Gemini. So, Google owns search. They also own Gemini. Gemini is Google's large language model, and it's being used to power AI overviews, AI mode, and presumably aspects of how search works, right? Because Gemini can read articles, assess them for topical authority or relevance, and all of that good stuff. So, a lot of our research lately, because we've focused on helping users rank on Google, was to understand how the Gemini model specifically works. I'll caveat this to say that all models, including ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, all of the Chinese models, everyone has a different spin and different weights that are associated with training data, web searches, tool calls, all of that good stuff. So primarily our analysis has been Gemini. Gemini, as of late, it might be, Gemini 3 or the training data updates associated with it, has essentially raised its bar in terms of wanting to give weight to a website that talks about its own brand, products, and services. So, a good example of this would be SEMrush and Ahrefs, right? We've all been in SEO, and we all know that those are the two market leaders in SEO tooling. When you look at or try to approximate the training data associated with SEO related searches, primarily commercial ones, with Gemini, what you will see is a distinct lack of citations or sources that point to any specific tool related blog or domain within their training data. So essentially when you look at, the sources that were used to construct a response for a prompt, that what are the best SEO tools, what we're seeing is very little citation rate against SEMrush and Ahrefs. And obviously, we know that if we were to Google it or to look at, our understanding of search, these are both very trusted brands, high topical authority, high brand mention rate. But Google is essentially applying a brand suppression on self promotion currently, which is why earlier this year, you saw Lily Ray, Gaetano, right, all of these different SEO influencers come out to say, yes, the listicle is being punished. But it was more nuanced than just the listicle is being punished. It was that self-promotional listicles were being punished. Obviously, if the listicle existed on a third party, and this is where it gets really weird, these are like third party sites that are like best dash SEO dash tools dot, like co slash UK. And you're seeing that basically show up within training data sources for what are the best SEO tools. And essentially, I think what has happened was that Gemini applied this self promotional suppression on websites that had any sort of incentive to talk about brands, products, or services. And as a result, a wide majority of actually good content got heavily reduced within Google's weight because I think they were probably saying we don't want any bias within the response that we're getting back. But the flip side then of the impact or consequence of that is actually that thin PBN, which stands for private blog network, which is a bunch of like puppet master websites that look like they're independently owned and operated, but are really controlled by, maybe a handful of people that then point links at their own products or their affiliate sites or whatever they want to do. Those sites are actually gaining authority as a result of this self promotional suppression that Gemini is currently doing. So, in essence, the private blog networks are back, right? It's if Google wants to penalize brands for talking about their own brand and other competitor brands, then Google has to find reliable, quote unquote, information from other sources. And what's happening is that these PBNs, oftentimes they're just content farms that are spinning on, GPT Claude, Gemini, whatever, are just pumping out, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of very thin, very kind of bleh content. But that's what Gemini is currently, weighting in their like 60 to 70% training data, which is what is used to, give you the response. The last like 30%, Gemini will do a web search, multiple web searches usually, to try to fill in, any inaccuracies, loose ends that it might have. And that's where we're seeing a SEMrush or an Ahrefs or a Moz graduate into like influencing the response by like, a 1, 5, 10% like edge. But other than that, it's the current world is Gemini says if you're a product or brand and you're talking about yourself and your competitors, then we're not going to value or weight that article very much. And so as a result, yeah, private blog networks, independent reviews, Reddit, these different independent third party sites are basically the benefactors of the suppression that's happening.
Okay, thank you. Important, like a couple of follow-ups though here. The first is actually this is an observation from me because we work with companies and like we B2B SaaS companies primarily, and like we've been doing this, like self promotional listicles and comparison guides and like all these like content types, or whatever you want to call them, keyword categories, whatever, doesn't matter. What I see is that companies and websites as an extension that use that or do that excessively were the ones that kind of got crushed from the January, algorithm update. For example, we analyzed a website a few months ago, and back then they were crashing it, right? But they had on their website in total, because we did the analysis, we knew that they had over 500 of these, pages of content, alternatives, listicles, software listicles, comparisons, reviews for competitors, pricing for competitors, the whole nine, everything, right? They got crushed. And so my first question is, do you think that like is that a contributing factor? Like the ratio of these pieces relative to the whole content inventory, or no? because I think my guess is that that plays a role, because when you have so many pages and you are a B2B software company, that goes against your business model. You are not a review site to include all these pieces of content, right? But I would like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I I think that's a smart hypothesis, and it could totally have some weight. My read on the situation is a little bit more nuanced. What I've seen, because I have this thesis, right, where self promotional content on a product or brand site is being suppressed. But then people will come to me and they'll say, well, Bernard, like, client A or client B, like, look, like this is a seven best in, like continuous integration for, Snowflake and blah. And you see, like, it's still rank number one or two. And like, I'm not seeing this like suppression. It's still being cited and sourced. And so, my take on what's happening is that it's more of a content density and competition reason. So, what I mean by that is for client A, who is doing continuous integration for Snowflake and data lakes and, ETL or whatever, there's just no other content that Gemini has to cite or to pull in. And so as a result, it must use that particular set of content that is a self promotional piece, because there is very little other content it can depend on to fill the training data that it wants for that particular topic. So that's my understanding. Maybe for your client who had all of this content, it was all just in very competitive ecosystems, right? Like CRM, email marketing, even SEO tools, very competitive. And as a result, Google has a lot more choice in selection to say, yes, well, we're just going to look at all this other independent bodies of content. But in super competitive, they have their choice. That at least that's what they think. And so you end up losing the self promotional stuff when you're in a competitive category. That's my take.
And that's why we brought you here, because these are the kinds of takes I want to hear. By the way, for the record, this wasn't a client. This was just a company we analyzed, right? Uh, I wish they were a client, at least before they got hit, but they are not a client. So another question, though. Okay, with all that, I get it. Still, though, like, and I had this discussion with a friend of mine on WhatsApp just yesterday, and he told me, man, like, okay, I get it, but like, what are companies, B2B SaaS companies, what are they supposed to do? Like, you have to do this piece of content, like, otherwise, you know what are you going to do? Like, what is and how to? And so the question is, should companies do it? And if so, like, are there any specific things that, like, they should kind of be aware of
Ah,
and be
yes.
careful of?
This is where, a lot of really interesting like stuff is happening. So there's so many different angles and perspectives to go on from here. Number one, we'll talk about what is, because that's, you like said that. What is classically informational intent, which is more or less definitions and things that everybody all agrees to. We've done extensive research at ClearScope, and what we found is that for what is content, pretty much 100% of the response for Gemini comes straight from training data. So it already has very high confidence that it knows what the what is, and why should it reference or refer to your pieces of content. It's basically kind of a, you're not getting anything for doing that. So essentially informational content, or put in another way, content that the models have a high confidence in answering based on training data, is already going to be extremely hard to influence. And there's basically no reason why you, as a B2B company, should target that type of query, because even if you were to graduate into helping the training data construct the response for the end user, no brands get mentioned, and citations and sources are basically dying as a referral source, as everybody kind of points out. So that's number one. Number two is now thinking about the agentic workflow. When you think about the agentic workflow, what you start to realize is that, and we observe this at ClearScope because we've been, doing a lot of AI visibility testing, trying to target the fan out of queries that ChatGPT and Gemini are performing to then influence the model to recommend our brand, or at least to win a citation, so on and so forth. But what you start to realize is that the way that the agent thinks is radically different than the way that users think. When you look at the internet as we know it today, and I think it's starting to shift. Most of the internet was created for humans to use and consume the content on websites and apps and so on and so forth. However, for agents think about things very differently, right? So agents have a knowledge base, aka training data, that it's trained on, and users are basically asking things against this blob of information, right? So when I go to Claude or Gemini or GPT, I'm basically saying, hey, I want to, write some SEO content, for example, right? And then Gemini and Claude might be like, oh, well, EEAT and this and that, right? It all comes from its training data. It might do some searches to be like, oh, is there anything new and interesting about, what's going on in SEO? But the reasoning as to why they're searching is fundamentally different than the reason why humans search, right? Humans search and they say, oh, I need to write, learn how to write an SEO content. And then I need to look at a domain, and then I need to say, okay, yeah, it's from HubSpot, I trust HubSpot, and click in, and then I kind of need this article to tell me, okay, here's the introduction, here's the body of content, here's the conclusion, right? That's kind of why the content, at least historically, has been designed that way. It's been designed for human consumption. However, when an agent searches or is looking for information, it's thinking about things completely differently than what the human is looking for, right? So if I'm going, yeah, I want to write, it's like, oh, okay, well, the agent's going to say, well, I need to think and say, oh, okay, well, SEO content may have changed. So I'm going to search biggest changes in SEO because my training data only goes to, January of 2025. So I need to know, did something change? And should I update my response before I respond to the end user? And it's basically trying to fill in gaps within its own knowledge before it constructs the, I call it a personalized piece of content, but the AI response to the end user. So in that way, you start to see that the models themselves have very strange search behavior, right? You've probably seen ChatGPT love site colon blah, right? It wants to find the specific site and verify something. That's essentially what it's doing, right? When I'm like, okay, I need to know how to write SEO content, ChatGPT might come back and say, okay, here's how you do it. Would you like some tools or some guides on, how to do it as a follow-up? And then as a user, I might be like, yeah, give me some tools. And so ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude is going to look at its blob of information and say, okay, well, I should recommend ClearScope and, X and Y and Z. And then it's going to say, but, ClearScope's pricing says it's $179. Before I say the pricing is $179, let me do site colon clearscope.io official site pricing. And then it's going to go and try to find exactly the information that it wants because it's like, I might have a gap here. And that's essentially what agents are doing. So the way that agents then think about things is fundamentally different than what humans are doing, which brings us to what I think is the dominant way that you as a B2B company should think about this is within your pricing page, your product pages, your use case pages, and your industry pages, right? Because when the models are thinking, what they're trying to do is like they're trying to go, okay, well, I have a dentist, I know that because, I save all the memory and context and stuff. And he's asking me, or he or she's asking me about, SEO stuff. So I know it's dental, SEO, and probably something to do with local SEO. So when they say, hey, what are the best tools? You can expect, right, the model to say, oh, well, okay, I kind of know some dental SEO and local SEO tools, but let me just pair those together just to see if there's any, tools I might be missing. So it's going to construct these searches that are like local SEO tool for content writing for dentists. That's why you get this really long string of a specific set of entities that the LLM is basically trying to figure out. That's why all these web searches, when you look under the hood, get kind of crazy and kind of long, right? It's like that. And in 2025, 2026, it does all these weird things. And because it's trying to patch like holes in its training data. So basically, as a B2B company who's creating content, you have to understand why agents are doing those searches, and it's to patch their information. And then you need to set up, right, landing pages to basically capture each one of those possibilities of a long tail permutation that the LLM is trying to fill. Also, what you need to recognize is that by creating an article, right? We're talking like a 3,000, 5,000 piece article for the LLM to consume, you are also fundamentally misunderstanding what agents want to do. Because, right, everybody talks about how Opus, which is from Claude, or Mythos or Codex, right? It's so expensive. Input tokens cost X per million and output tokens cost Y per million. Super expensive. What you're doing when you give an agent a 3,000 to 5,000 word article is you're basically forcing it to say, okay, here's like 10,000 to 30,000 tokens that you have to expend to read this giant glob of blah that was actually fundamentally designed for human consumption. But from an agentic perspective, they're just there because they want to hit specific points that they care about. So that's why you see this movement that people are talking about with schema and markdown files and JSON, because, like put in a very simple explanation, let's say we have a pricing page. Pricing page, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it has the cards, all of this stuff, and that's great for humans. But when an agent looks at it, it could just a jumble of JavaScript and pictures and this and that. What the agent would much rather prefer, rather than downloading the entire document object model, which is the HTML page, ingesting it all, spending 10 to 20,000 tokens to find their information, is that they would just prefer a path where there's a markdown file or a JSON file that says clear scope, pricing, package, basic, price like monthly, or, cadence monthly, price 99, credits X, other credits Y. And then it just looks at that, right? So if you look at like how the agent is going to make decisions, it might look at a document object model and say, oh, that's going to cost me 25,000 tokens to ingest, and compute is not free. Or it's going to look at, like a JSON or a markdown file and say, oh, okay, well, that's just like 300 tokens. Like, that's easy. I'm just going to grab that. And that's, why I came to this page. So that's what I'm seeing happen within, this whole like thing that's playing out, is that people are incorrectly lumping AEO, GEO, AI search with SEO, but it is fundamentally two different things. The reason why they are not completely, but they're correlated in this exact moment, is because we as content creators and marketers have not begun to really design experiences for agents to consume. So agents are forced to consume like basically is suboptimal experiences to get the information that they need. But once that movement really starts to happen and you kind of see Cloudflare like trying to be like, yeah, markdown for agents, this for agents, right? Once that movement really starts to snowball, yeah, it's going to be a fundamentally different way of thinking about, like AEO or AI search compared to SEO.
On this last part though, does that mean then that like websites should start, to think, okay, you have the website that's for humans, right? But like start thinking about kind of like a parallel website, which is designed just for agent consumption. Is that like, something that brands should consider? And if so, do you have any tips around that, or like how should companies go about it?
I think that it's an unfolding field. So the evidence and the conclude, like to say that like, okay, this definitively works or does not work is still, kind of unfolding. But I think that like having like a JSON block on your pricing page makes a lot of sense. Or, doing the Cloudflare like approach where you have a markdown file that, when the agent requests the page, you have a different page that's for the agent that is a markdown file. Or right, if the user agent is a human, then you serve the like actual web page. So you're kind of seeing these like deviations. And I think that that works, but only for topics where structured data is the like end goal of why the agent wants to visit your site in the first place. That's why I brought up pricing, because pricing is a very, very good example. You see Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, all to some variation of like site colon clearscope.io official site pricing 2026. Like it searches that exactly because what it's trying to do is confirm before it gives a response that its own understanding of the pricing is up to date. So it's looking for that. That makes a lot of sense. So we're starting to see then like some sort of a gradient where on the extreme left, you have things that are just completely answerable through structured data. And this is going to be things like, where should I eat tonight, right? Google Maps, restaurants near me, different cuisines, structured data. And then you have all the way to the right, what we call pure opinion and like thought leadership content, right? These are not things that structured data can answer, right? It's not like, I write a blog post on how, the future of search is agentic. And then, I give a markdown file that says, oh, sentiment for this thing is zero point 0.6 and, it contains 7,000 words. And, that makes complete nonsense to make into structured data because it's an opinion piece, right? And so what you're starting to see is that for prompts and topics where the model is specifically looking to enrich its own answer by looking for specific, data enrichment criteria, then on the left, you do want JSON blocks and like markdown files because the agent is going to say, yes, that is exactly what I need. It's way more token efficient. Whereas on the right, if you're trying to come out and say, invent a new term or, have a thought leadership piece, that obviously does not make sense to have a structured data like set. And so it's starting to like kind of unfold in those like particular ways.
You mentioned topical authority in your previous answers a couple of times, and I wanted to ask, do you think that this is still a thing, especially for like AI search?
No,
No?
it doesn't appear to fundamentally have any sort of correlation at the moment for AI search. That said, I think there are two very big components of AI search. Number one is training data. I think for training data, topical authority still matters because what Gemini and Google is Gemini, what Claude and GPT want is to basically have this blob of information and have it be the best, most unbiased, accurate depiction of all the topics that somebody could want to query against. In that way, I think training data will care tons about topical authority. But then on the flip side, the model gets built with the trillions of parameters that goes into the model, it seems that the model itself, when it searches, does not care about topical authority. It was trained on a bunch of stuff that theoretically should have topical authority, but when it searches, again, it's searching very specifically to patch in knowledge gaps or places of misunderstanding that it might have. And in those searches, we are seeing like there is no correlation with topical authority. And I guess, theoretically, why should there be, right? Like Gemini or ChatGPT is like, well, I don't know what this is. Or, like when it's trying to answer a question, it's like, I need to know exactly like this. It's just going to search and try to find exactly that. It's not necessarily caring that, oh yeah, that came from like the New York Times, because 70 to 100% of the response that it's giving back to the end user is just based on training data itself. So again, right, it seems like the AI search component doesn't really care about topical authority, but you do need to care about topical authority if you want to make the corpus of the training data, which shapes 60 to 100% of the response in the first place.
Yeah, but couldn't that be a filter for what we were discussing earlier around, like spam, the rise of spam and PBNs and whatnot? Meaning, shouldn't, or I guess, couldn't in the future, like all these AI search engines develop some sort of like metric that I think we know at this point that Google itself, also has about, websites, um, so that it knows that, what, I may like conduct a search and I may like get this piece of content as one of the results, but it has a very low score, however you want to call it, like domain authority, doesn't matter. So I can't take it as like seriously as another website that scores higher. I guess that could serve as a solution to the PBN slash spam problem, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a variety of ways that it's happening. I think one of the most interesting things when we were doing a lot of research into Gemini specifically is that what we found was that basically the experiment was we took a a bunch of prompts, we ran them 100 times against Gemini and ChatGPT on day zero to establish a control. In that establishment of a control, like we found, anywhere between 0% to 100% brand mentions, web searches, and citations that occurred. We then took that and we ran 100 prompts, every subsequent day moving forward. And the results of that was mind opening. So what ended up happening is that what we found is that once the model gets built, people say that large language model responses are probabilistic, and we know that, right? Probabilistic saying that if I ask it something, I'm going to get back a different response than if you ask it the same thing. However, over the course of a large sample size, everything gets normalized into a probability. So if I ask, like what are the best B2B, SaaS content agencies, I'm going to see, something like, I'm just going to make this up, but right, something like 78% of the time, minutia gets mentioned. And over time, running it 100, 100, 100, 100 throughout the course, what you find, what you learn is that that doesn't change. It's just about the same. And the variance that you get is just that random variance of, like temperature, essentially. But over time, more or less within the training data and the same model, you're going to get mostly the same results back. It varies depending on intent. So anyways, I say all of that to say what Gemini does is that it once you run the 100 set, every single other 100 set, it randomly pulls in citations. It's like trying to use citations to like improve its answer. And I get the feeling that Gemini is basically treating sources as the new like user engagement signal, right? So they'll say, okay, for this response, I'm going to pull in this set of 20. And then for this other, for the same prompt, I'm going to try like constructing it in all these different manners. And, I'm going to see how the user reacts to this, like, this response. And so what is happening is that I think Gemini is basically trying to do user engagement signal testing using citations and sources. Gemini also searches the most. I mean, that makes sense because it's owned by Google. On average, a prompt gets like 6 different searches. And so basically, what it's doing is that it's pulling it in, it's trying something. And then if the user ends up having a bad experience, then it's probably going to say, okay, well, whatever that set of citations was, I'm just going to throw it away. So my opinion is that yes, we're probably going to see like thin content sites like eventually get weeded out through this particular like sampling that Gemini is doing. And so I think it's just a temporary loophole. I think the self promotion suppression, I think, is also a temporary overreaction on Gemini's part. And we've been in search for long enough to know that Google might do like a helpful content update and tune things really like strict on one end or really lenient on the other end, and then see what happens. And then 2 months later, Gemini is gonna be like, yeah, it wasn't so good, and then dial like some other knobs, and then everything will like normalize again. So I don't think that this pattern is here to stay. I think that it's just Google just cranked some dials and then self-promotional stuff just got like nuked. But I think Google's probably gonna recognize that, like, well, Ahrefs and SEMrush are these brands that talk about their own products and the competitive landscape actually have the most subject matter expertise. So they can't just throw them out. They might apply, some sort of, bias like thing against it, but still use like the data that, these sites perform. So I think it's just a temporary loophole. Google's probably just being like, yeah, we should try this. And then after a few months, Google or Gemini is going to be like, yeah, that was probably not so good. Let's like dial it back to, some other stuff.
We did a study and we found that there are over 200. Well, if you count the incumbents, like traditional SEO software that also offer AI search tracking capabilities, you know, I would say the number is somewhere between 250 and 300 at this point. So, and this, is a new, relatively new category, but you already have all these solutions in the market, right? In the market competing for like market share. Is AI search tracking solved with all these tools we have, or are we missing things?
Oh my God. You've like touched a soft spot because again, we don't like to say things we are not certain of, and we don't like to design products that are ineffective. That said, the majority of search tracking solutions or AI search tracking solutions on the market are very incorrect. And what I mean by that, and I don't want to call out names or shame anybody, but essentially, it's been a complete race to the bottom. And so essentially what everybody does is that they cut corners and they offer more models, right? So on the cheap end, you have AI search providers saying, yes, we will offer you, like basically one prompt, 5 models, Perplexity, Claude, Gemini, GPT, DeepSeek, Manus, whatever. And, that's going to be 50 cents a month or $1 a month. And people are like, great, I need that because leadership is breathing down my back. And if I don't tell them what my brand visibility is, I'm screwed. So everybody then price anchors against that. What the problem is that the majority of the people offering AI search solutions are doing it against models without web search enabled. So essentially, what they're doing, and the reasoning as to why they're doing that, is because the majority of the cost of running a prompt is billed through the web search itself. Anytime Gemini performs a web search, if you hit the API, it costs 1.4 cents. Gemini really likes to search. So for a prompt, it will most of the time hit web searches 6 times. 6 times 1.4 cents is close to 9 cents in just the search itself. Then you say that's one prompt. Then you run it 30 times, and you're looking at $2.70 for daily prompt tracking against Gemini with web search enabled. $2.70. That's not even counting ChatGPT, which when ChatGPT searches, that's another cent. And then that's not even counting Opus, which is very expensive. However, if you strip out all of the web searches, then the fundamental response that you get back, right? If you say, okay, well, I'm just going to hit Gemini, I'm going to not do web search enabled, that's a fraction of a penny. So that's what everybody's doing. They're like, "Oh, okay, well, we'll just bundle, a non-web search version of the prompt tracking." And what we found is that what you're getting back is just random variance in training data. Because if you sample, a prompt like 100 times, you're going to find, and no web search enabled, you're just going to find that it normalizes to, brand X gets mentioned 60%, brand, Y gets mentioned 50%, and brand Z gets mentioned 40%. And if there is no web search enabled, it's essentially the model and the training data, both of which do not change very frequently. And so a bunch of a bunch of prompt trackers are basically just giving out data that does not update. And you're going to just see like a little like wobble of variance essentially throughout the course of how you're monitoring it until the training data updates or the model updates. And everyone's buying this stuff and then being like, well, I'm not getting more AI visibility. And you're not, because the training data has not updated and the model has not updated. And if the model is not searching, which for the majority of these prompt trackers, they're not searching, then you're not going to get any change. So, anyways, yeah, I get it though, right? It's a brand new market. The space is moving very quickly, all of this stuff. But to do prompt tracking correctly, what we recommend is that you run a sample of 20 up front for the same prompt to establish a baseline. You do it with web search enabled. And so that's 20 prompts. This is all Gemini, right? That's already $1.80 to just do the initial setup. And then it's another $2.70 to monitor it daily throughout a month. So you're looking at $4, $5 a month for one prompt and one model. But no one wants to buy that because everybody else is like, well, we got 5 models for 50 cents. And so, I mean, that's just the state of where we're at.
Thanks for giving us a look under the hood of the economics of prompt tracking. Um, okay, yeah. I mean, my sense is that AI search tracking is not solved, no matter what most of these tools say. I want to be respectful of your time, Bernard. So this will be my last question. And so, to the person who is listening and they are under the gun, we need to get visibility in AI search. To the marketer who is struggling to like figure things out and navigate this new world, uh, what should they? What's your message like? What should they pay attention to? What should they focus on? And what should they do?
Yeah. I mean the sand is shifting super fast. I guess the best metaphor or analogy that I can say, it's the early 2000s, and currently Yahoo is the absolute thing that everybody is talking about. But then 6 months later, this small thing called Google is coming out of the blue, and well, they seem like they have a good shot, but who knows, right? So Yahoo is the Chat GPT, and the Google that is emerging is Claude, right? In this particular case. And so 6 months ago, nobody really gave much of an interest in Claude, because well, what was that, right? But now 6 months later, everyone's like, oh, Chat GPT, Codex, like, boo, that thing sucks, right? It's all about Claude, and Claude is the new, like, hot kid on the block. So I mean, the truth of the matter is that no one knows anything about anything that's going on. I mean, I try to know, because I'm in the business, but even I don't really know. I couldn't have said Claude was going to come out, and just storm the market in 6 months, and now everybody wants to know. Oh well, how do if you're a B2B company, you're like, yes, I need to rank in Claude. And it's like, well, I mean, we were just doing all kinds of research in ChatGPT and Gemini, because those were the two frontier, like, leaders. And now we have a Claude thing, and I have no idea how Claude, searches or doesn't search, why it searches, what weights are associated with it. So that brings us to where we are today. I mean, really, the only best, like, advice that I can give is that you just have to be super agile at this point, right? Recognize that what you were doing before is very unlikely to continue to work, right? If you're still just, like, building, like, written content that's designed for humans that are targeting, best X, posts, like, and you're just seeing your traffic disappear, or your impressions, spike up, but your clicks, go down. Like, mix it up, right? Like, try some product pages. Try, serving a markdown file on your product pages. Try serving markdown files across your blog posts, and then just, like monitor your analytics and see, like, oh, okay, well, Bing seems to like that. Like, if Bing likes that, then maybe that means ChatGPT likes that. Or, vice versa, like, Google seems to be sending a lot of traffic here because I did that. So, like, why is that happening? And so, yeah, just, you have to try things. Like, right now, it's basically the early days of the internet, and no one knows anything, including myself, like, so you just have to find the proof in your pudding, and then know that in 3 to 6 months, that truth that you found may be completely different. And that's just the state of search and AI currently.
Okay, that's a wrap. Bernard, thank you, man. Final thing, where can people, get in touch with you if they'd like to? What's the best place?
Best place, LinkedIn or X. I mean, either one is a good place to find me. Yeah, just type Bernard Huang. You'll find me, like, on those.
Bernard, thank you, man. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing all these things with us. And good luck with everything you're working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for having me.